Hello, my name is Wildstag, and thank you for tuning in to another used book rant. Today, I'm going to be covering this book, The Secret Knowledge of Water, written by Craig Childs. There's a cool tagline at the top of the cover that says, "There are two easy ways to die in the desert, thirst and drowning." Now, the cover design is by Mario Polis. The cover photograph by David Mwench slash Tony Stone Images. And the author photograph is by Derek Harwell. It doesn't actually say this on here. I assume Tony Stone Images is this cover image, and then the other one listed is the back cover image. I can't be certain. It doesn't specifically cite which is which, but I will say that, yeah, it's not on the inside either. I do not recall where I bought this book, but I'm confident it has to have been used when I bought it because this one is first Back Bay paper edition, May 2001, reprinted by arrangement with Sasquatch Books. The reason I suspect this was used is that I couldn't have bought this earlier than 2011, maybe 2012. And despite that, the other information is that this, like, the blurb inside the cover says his other books include Crossing Paths, Uncommon Encounters with Animals in the Wild, and the credits, the copyright page also says, also by Craig Childs, Stone Desert, a naturalist's exploration of Canyonlands National Park, Grand Canyon, Time Below the Rim, Grand Canyon Stories, Then and Now, Colorado, photographs by Art Wolf, and Crossing Paths, Uncommon Encounters with Animals in the Wild. What isn't listed here is the animal dialogues, which I have ranted about on this channel before, and is the one that got me into reading his books. He's also written Atlas of a Lost World, Travels in Ice Age America. I bought that a while back, I think at Carlsbad Caverns National Park, and I just haven't gotten around to reading that one. This one is from 2019, and I've seen his name on other books as well, including one I recently finished. He wrote a blurb of praise on The Age of Deer, himself and Rick Bass, which I thought was really cool. Now, when I finished that book, I have some other thoughts about that one, and I'll get around to that on another weekend, I'm sure, but it wasn't as intriguing as I had hoped it would be. It was very American centric and very closely linked to, it kind of had felt like The Age of Deer felt like it had tunnel vision on white-tailed deer rather than expanding its research into other species of deer, even just ones you would find in the United States of America, like mule deer or elk. It was very laser focused on white-tailed deer. But that's something entirely different from this book, The Secret Knowledge of Water. It is separated into multiple sections. Part 1 is ephemeral water. Part 2 is water that moves. And part 3 is fierce water. And ephemeral water is a section that I really enjoyed because one, there was an interesting section on Padre Eusebio Kino. That figure is important for the history of Arizona. But also, and this being something I'd commented on a while back, it is, that section is indicative of his kind of lineage in his writing history, because the book opens up with a discussion about basins called tinajas, which are, as he describes, and it's an older Spanish word for jars. And in the desert, you'll see this on all sorts of, I've seen it on personal travels. So I've seen it on accounts like Desert Drifter and a couple other accounts that do similar content where they'll show small holes in the ground where water persists despite not having had rain in a while. And they persist because the shape of this naturally occurring hole prevents evaporative pressures such as heat and direct sun exposure from affecting them for even more hours of the day than the overall like creek bed or canyon does. They're ephemeral spots of water where they exist and hold water for a lot longer than surrounding desert. So what Padre Kino did was in the early years of exploration into Arizona, Spanish exploration, he traveled around on a mule or with a mule, and he carried basically just enough to do the daily rites of the Eucharist, the body and blood of Christ, and his prayers. And what made him unique in the annals of history, especially Spanish dominion over the Americas, is that this guy was very gentle and peaceful. I haven't seen any stories of him abusing the local native population in any way. He wandered around the desert, mapped out these tinajas, which eventually did allow for imperialism and colonialism in the area to set up or, create trade routes where the Spanish could travel through the area. So it wasn't purely benign, but it wasn't, this Padre Quino's actions weren't intentionally malign. So there's that, but also Cabeza Prieta is the region that Edward Abbey ran in. It's also the region that other authors I've discussed on this channel explored and did their writing and living in as well. So Gary Paul Nabin, who's right on the shelf over here, having written "The Desert Smells Like Rain," or Dexter K. Oliver, who wrote Tracks in the Sand, who did a lot of work in southeast Arizona, or Harley G. Shaw, who also did a lot of work in that area as well. And he was the author of Stalking the Big Bird, which I've got on my shelf over here. And I want to say he did Soul Among Lions, which is another one, Cougar as Peaceful Adversary. And I'm fairly certain I've done a video on that one. And there were a lot of authors that used southeast and southwest Arizona as their stomping grounds, and Craig Childs carries that torch. He brings that region to a younger audience where Edward Abbey, Harley Shaw, Gary Paul Nabin, they were all writing in the 80s, late 70s, and early 90s. Harley Shaw reaching into the late 90s. And Rick Bass mostly in the late 80s and 90s, and to a certain extent in the 2000s. Craig Childs didn't get his start until the late 90s and is mostly an author of the 2000s and 2010s. He is writing still in the 2020s, but that's when his career started. And so this is an exploration of those same regions, that first part, the ephemeral waters that I was talking about. But he also talks about source waters, and specifically the way the Grand Canyon interacted with the Native American tribes that claim descendancy from a group of people that lived there. And for that one, I can think of, what was it? There Was a River, which I think I still have on these shelves. Yes, There Was a River by Bruce Berger, who did some exploration of that region. And so there's all sorts of authors that I've read that have explored those regions at different times in history when in Berger's case, he was one of the last people to travel down the Colorado River before the Glen Canyon Dam was finished. And so he has experiences with that. Craig Childs has experiences with that region, but at a much later period in time. And he discusses this partially in his mountain lion section in Animal Dialogues, but he also discusses it in this book as well. He discusses flash flooding and the way that can be dangerous and damaging to its surroundings. And he doesn't mention it in this book, but it's something I've learned from interacting with Diné friends of mine, otherwise called Navajo, is that they have this idea of rain being either male or female. And Craig Childs discusses, not in those terms, but those kinds of water. The female rain being the nourishing rain that is tied to growth and is tied to agriculture. It's the kind of rain that gets soaked up into the dirt that allows their maize corn to grow, that allows their beans and squash to grow. It's the rain that nourishes the earth. And then the male rain, which is associated with thunderstorms and with erosion and with flash flooding. There are two rain deities within, at least two, but two prominent rain deities within the Navajo, the Diné myth, which is a male and a female personification, those two. And like I said, Craig Childs doesn't discuss it in those terms in this book, but he does discuss those kinds of water. And as I'm flipping through it, I will say it is kind of ironic, but this copy has water damage on it. Specifically, if you can see it here, you can see kind of the staining and the kind of warping to this. So my copy has been through multiple years of experience of stresses, whether me turning the pages, which you'll see like on the back cover, that damage, or myself getting it wet. And I've also gotten other books wet. I want to say there was a Rick Bass book that I discussed a couple of years ago that had coffee stains on it. So like, this is a book that I've read a long time, I've reread a couple times, and has some really interesting knowledge to pass on to people that are interested in learning about the desert, especially the Southwest US desert, and how people have interacted with the forces that shaped it. And you don't think of the desert as a place of rain, but what he does, and kind of like what Gary Paul Nabin discusses in The Desert Smells Like Rain, but if you spend enough time, as these natives have spent thousands of years, as the Spanish have spent hundreds of years, and how the Americans have spent a bit more than a century, maybe 150 years, these people are shaped by rain. And it's not in this book, and I forget which book it was in, but there was a discussion about how, An American Bison, I believe is the one that I was reading, that discusses how, like, the Clovis culture was only, like, that archaeological culture was first discovered by Anglo-Americans because of a flash flood on someone's property, that this century flood washed away, like, 12 feet of silt in a creek bed turned into an arroyo, almost a canyon, and in the dirt on the edges, he could see, the landowner, a former slave, he could see the Clovis culture. And so you don't necessarily think of the desert as a place defined by rain, but that's what Craig Childs seeks to do in this book, is to inform a reader about the various ways in which water shapes the concept of the Southwest American desert, and how people think of their place in it, that you have to be thinking about water in the terms of thirst, but you have to be thinking about it in the terms of drowning and flash flooding, but you have to think about it in terms of, like, heat loss and risk management, in the terms of, like, with thunderstorms or with torrential downpours. And so this is a really interesting book because it discusses a lot of those perspectives and the different angles from which you understand water in the desert. So this book is from 2000 and it's one of his first books. I think one of his books that really pushed him to the forefront of nature writing in America. He is an incredible author and I really like this book. Like I said, I've read it a couple times and I've had it for at least 15 years. And I think if you don't have this book already, or you haven't read it and you want to learn about the desert, this is a more accessible way to read it because this author has more books about the cultural and physical space of the desert Southwest. I do still recommend The Desert Smells Like Rain by Gary Paul Nabin, the one that I've been pointing to a couple times behind me. But if you haven't read this one, or if you have, I'd recommend rereading it. I'd recommend reading it. It's going to be a good way to spend your money to pick this book up. And if you find it used, all the better. You can definitely find it at a library if you don't want to spend money on this. And, always support your libraries. So, anyway, I really love this book, and I hope that you guys do as well. Anyway, my name is Wildstag, and thank you for tuning in to another used book rant.